So there's a lot of confusion right now about LIBOR. What is LIBOR? LIBOR is an interbank rate. It is the interest rate at which banks lend and borrow from each other, and it's set in London. There is, I think it's the British Bankers Association set the rate. And the tricky thing about LIBOR is it's not the actual rate at which banks lend and borrow. It's what the banks report that they're lending and borrowing, right? So it's a reported rate rather than a rate we can observe in the marketplace. And this is why there's been a lot of issues about misreporting, about fraud, about manipulating, because it's relatively easy to manipulate this rate because all the bank has to do is report a number that's different than the actual number that they are lending and borrowing at. This is a rate that mostly involves European banks. There are 3 American banks that are involved in reporting LIBOR and therefore in setting this rate. Now, it's important because a lot of variable rate loans are linked to LIBOR. So a lot of people probably have mortgages that are LIBOR plus some fixed amount. And the rate will vary depending on LIBOR varying. So LIBOR is important to a lot of people who've borrowed money and a lot of people who've, who are issuing bonds and pay money. So anybody on either side of a transaction of a variable rate bond is going to be exposed to LIBOR. Now, the issue is that the claim right now is that during the financial crisis in particular, but starting in 2007, and I haven't seen what the claims are until when this continued, there was manipulation of this rate, particularly manipulation of reporting it as too low. That is, reporting LIBOR rates lower than what the actual lending and borrowing rates were, or reporting LIBOR rates when during the 2008-2009, when banks just weren't borrowing money from each other because nobody would lend money. The markets froze up. Nobody trusted anybody else. Banks were on the verge of default. So there was no lending going on. So they were reporting numbers even though there was no real market. Now, this is really, this being a crisis is really suspicious to me. First of all, who has an incentive to get the banks to report as low a rate as possible so that all these mortgages and other loans are denominated in a very low interest rate? Well, the central banks do. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, during this period were trying to drive interest rates as low as they could. So they drove the Fed funds rate, which is the rate at which banks in the U.S. lend and borrow from each other, but it's set by the Fed and manipulated by the Fed. They were driving that rate lower. They were driving all the interest rates that they could control as low as they could get them. Now imagine if the banks then start reporting higher interest rates because of uncertainty about their solvency and the risk involved in lending them money. Then that would have driven up rates, just as the central banks are trying to drive rates down. So there's no doubt in my mind that both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England put pressure on the banks to report lower and lower rates during this period. The real scandal here is the behavior of the central banks at manipulating interest rates. This is a problem of having a central banking system. We should have a free banking system. But as they're manipulating the rents, to then blame the bankers for manipulating rates seems to be ridiculous, particularly given that the bankers were manipulating the rates, it seems, in the same directions as the central banks. And according to some evidence, they were doing so on the direction of the central banks. Now, were these banks making money because they could create derivatives that made money off the spreads, the difference between the actual rates and the reported rates? Possibly. Could this constitute fraud? Possibly. But the big picture here is the manipulation of the markets by the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and the European Central Bank. This is a central banking problem. And to find scapegoats and bankers is just wrong. It misses the point. This is a way of diverting attention away from the real problems with central banking and pretending that the causes of the financial crisis, the reason we're in this mess, the reason things are getting worse is somehow bankers who are fraudulent. That is not the issue. And let's also remember who benefited from these lower rates above and beyond central bankers. Homeowners did. Millions and millions of American homeowners have their mortgages linked to LIBOR. Imagine if LIBOR had been rising, and more and more homeowners would have gone insolvent. Now, maybe that's what the market should have done. I'm not making a comment on that, but imagine the response of politicians. Imagine the response of central bankers. They would have scapegoated the bankers for raising LIBOR. Now they're scapegoating the bankers for keeping it too low. This is so hypocritical. This is so wrong. And again, just a tactic to divert attention from the real culprits here, the real problems with central banking and the behavior of Congress and the president.